Jamal never imagined his life could change in an instant. 1 minute, he was just another kid walking home from the store. And the next, he was surrounded by flashing lights, staring into the face of a police officer accusing him of something he didn't do. The sound of sirens ripped through the peaceful afternoon, making heads turn. A police car screeched to a stop, and Officer Richards, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a hardened face, stepped out with purpose, his sharp eyes locked onto one person, Jamal. Jamal, just 14 years old, had been taking his usual route home. A small bag of chips rested in his hand, and his thoughts were far from trouble. But as soon as he saw the officer's glare, he felt the shift in the air. Something was wrong. "That's him! He did it!" Richard's voice rang out, filled with certainty. Jamal's stomach dropped. He looked around, expecting someone else to step forward, but the officer's accusing finger pointed straight at him. Confusion twisted inside him. "Did what?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Officer Richards took a step closer. "You stole a man's wallet and ran. We have an eyewitness." Jamal's mind raced. He hadn't stolen anything. He had just left the store. Couldn't they check the cameras? His lips parted to explain, but before he could say a word, Richards grabbed his wrist. The bag of chips fell to the pavement. The people on the street stopped to watch. Some whispered amongst themselves, others pulled out their phones to record. Suddenly, a woman's frantic voice pierced the silence. "Jamal!" His mother, Tanya, rushed forward, panic in her eyes. "What's going on? What are you doing to my son?" Officer Richards didn't even blink. "Step back, ma'am." Tanya planted herself in front of him, refusing to move. "Where's your proof?" Her voice shook with anger. "My son didn't steal anything." Richard's expression remained cold. "We have a witness." Jamal's heart hammered in his chest. Who was lying about him? Before he could process it, the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Tanya's scream caught in her throat. Jamal swallowed hard. No one was listening. No one believed him. And just like that, his life changed forever. Who is this so-called eyewitness? And why are they lying? Have you ever been in a situation where no one believed you? What did you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? Drop your city below. The police car door slammed shut, sealing Jamal inside the cold metal cage of the back seat. His hands, still cuffed, rested in his lap, his fingers twitching as panic coursed through his veins. He looked out the window, his mother pounding on the glass, screaming at the officers, demanding answers. Outside, Tanya's voice trembled with rage and fear. "You have no proof. My son didn't do anything. Let him go." Officer Richards barely looked at her. "Step away, ma'am, or you'll be arrested too." The words hit like a slap. The crowd murmured, some shifting uncomfortably. People recorded, but no one stepped forward to help. Jamal's breath was shallow. He had heard stories like this before, but now he was living it. The ride to the station was silent, too silent. Jamal stared at the cage separating him from the front seats. He wanted to say something, to plead his case, but the lump in his throat wouldn't let him. As soon as they reached the precinct, the doors swung open, and rough hands yanked him out. They led him down a long, dimly lit hallway to a small interrogation room. No windows, just a metal table, 2 chairs, and a single buzzing light overhead. Jamal's legs shook as they forced him into the chair. Officer Richards stood on the other side, arms crossed. "Let's make this simple, kid. Just admit it. Tell us where you stashed the wallet." Jamal's mouth fell open. "I don't have a wallet. I told you, I didn't steal anything." Richards sighed dramatically and leaned in closer. "The longer you lie, the worse this gets for you." Jamal's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Was this really happening? Outside the room, his mother was demanding to see him, but another officer blocked her way. We need to process him first. Tanya's hands clenched into fists. You don't get to treat my son like a criminal without evidence. Meanwhile, a second officer, Detective Monroe, stood watching the scene unfold. Something about this case didn't sit right with him. Then, the so-called eyewitness arrived. An elderly white man, Mr. Collins, walked in slowly, his face wrinkled with uncertainty. He glanced at Richards, then at Jamal. "That's him," Collins muttered, but his voice wavered. Detective Monroe narrowed his eyes. Something wasn't adding up. Will anyone believe Jamal's side of the story? Or is the case already lost? Jamal sat in the interrogation room, his fingers trembling as they tapped against the cold metal table. He knew he was innocent. But who would believe him? Officer Richards leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face smug. "This is your last chance, kid. Confess, and maybe the judge will go easy on you." Jamal swallowed hard, his voice firm. "I didn't do anything." Outside, his mother, Tanya, was still arguing with the officers, her voice filled with desperation. "You can't keep him in there without evidence." Detective Monroe, watching from the hallway, furrowed his brow. Something felt off. The so-called eyewitness, Mr. Collins, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes darted from the officers to Tanya, then back to Jamal. "Are you sure it was this boy?" Monroe asked, his voice calm but sharp. Mr. Collins hesitated. I think so. I saw someone running and, well, he looks like him." Monroe's expression darkened. "So, you're not actually sure?" A tense silence fell over the room. Officer Richards clenched his jaw. "He's the only one who fits the description." Monroe wasn't convinced. Something wasn't right. Then, an idea struck him. He stepped away, pulling out his phone. Meanwhile, inside the interrogation room, Jamal sat with his hands still cuffed. His eyes burned with frustration, but he refused to cry. A few moments later, Monroe returned, with a piece of evidence that would change everything. He placed his phone on the table and hit play. A grainy security camera video filled the screen. It was footage from the convenience store Jamal had just left. The timestamp showed he was inside the store at the exact time of the crime. Jamal's heart leaped. This was it. Proof. Officer Richards' face went pale. Monroe turned to Mr. Collins. "So, are you still sure it was him?" Mr. Collins swallowed hard. I guess I might have been mistaken." Jamal exhaled sharply. Finally, someone was listening. Will this be enough to clear Jamal's name? Or will Officer Richards try to cover it up? For the first time since this nightmare began, Jamal felt a spark of hope. The security footage proved his innocence. But would the officers admit their mistake? Detective Monroe turned the screen toward Officer Richards. "This video clearly shows the boy inside the store at the time of the theft. He couldn't have done it." Richards' jaw tightened. His fingers twitched against his belt. He had been so sure. But now he was standing in front of an entire department, a recording phone in the corner, and a mother who refused to back down. Tanya's eyes burned with anger. "You were ready to throw my son's life away over an assumption. Now let him go." But Richards wasn't giving in. His pride wouldn't let him. Maybe the footage is wrong. Maybe he had an accomplice. Jamal's fists clenched. "That's a lie. You just don't want to admit you were wrong." Detective Monroe stepped forward. "Enough." His voice was calm, but the authority behind it was undeniable. "We have no evidence against this boy. And we have video proving he was elsewhere. There is no case." Richard's face was turning red. He looked at his fellow officers, searching for support, but they weren't backing him up. The energy in the room had shifted. Then Monroe turned to the officer guarding Jamal. Uncuff him, now." The room went silent. The only sound was the metal click of the cuffs opening. Jamal rubbed his wrists, feeling the sting of where they had been too tight. Tanya rushed to him, pulling him into her arms. She held him tightly, whispering, "I've got you, baby. You're safe." But Jamal wasn't just relieved, he was furious. Would this have happened if he had been someone else? Before they left, Tanya turned back to Richards. "I hope you remember this moment, because we won't forget it." And with that, she took Jamal's hand, and they walked out, free. Will Richards be held accountable for his actions, or will he walk away without consequences? The courtroom was dead silent as Officer Richards stood before the judge, sweat beading on his forehead. The walls seemed to close in around him. The once confident officer was now the one being questioned. Across the room, Jamal sat next to his mother, his hands still sore from where the handcuffs had dug into his wrists. He had spent hours in a jail cell for something he didn't do. Now, he was about to see if the system would hold the real guilty party accountable. Judge Williams, an older black woman with a firm but fair expression, peered down at Richards. "Officer Richards, why did you arrest this boy?" Richards swallowed hard. I thought it was him." His voice lacked the confidence he had once spoken with. Miss Carter, the attorney representing Jamal, leaned forward, her tone sharp. Or was it because he was black? A ripple of tension spread through the room. Richards opened his mouth, but no words came out. The truth hung in the air, unspoken, undeniable. Tanya, sitting beside Jamal, clenched her fists. She had spent her whole life watching black boys be accused without evidence. This time, she wasn't letting it slide. Judge Williams narrowed her eyes. "Officer Richards, in this courtroom, we deal with facts, not assumptions. And the facts show you arrested an innocent child without any proof." Richards' breathing grew unsteady. He glanced toward the other officers in the room, searching for support. But no one spoke for him. He was alone. The judge leaned forward, her voice firm. "This court demands an internal investigation into Officer Richards' conduct." Murmurs spread through the room. People started nodding, whispering. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. This was about justice. Richards' face turned pale. His entire career, built on power and authority, was now hanging by a thread. Jamal watched him carefully. The officer had expected to walk away without consequences. But now, everything was about to change. Will Richards lose his badge? Or will the system protect him? The air in the courtroom felt heavy, filled with the weight of everything Jamal had endured. He had been arrested, humiliated, and treated like a criminal. But now, the truth was finally out. The entire room waited for the judge's ruling. Judge Williams adjusted her glasses, looking directly at Jamal. "This court finds that Jamal Brown was wrongfully arrested without evidence." Jamal held his breath. Then the judge turned to Tanya. "On behalf of this court, I want to express my deepest regrets for what your son had to go through." Tanya's lips trembled. She had fought so hard for this moment, and now it was here. Judge Williams continued, her voice firm. "This case never should have reached this point. The officers involved failed to follow protocol, and this young man was forced to suffer because of their negligence." She turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have anything to say?" The prosecutor, a middle-aged man in a dark suit, cleared his throat and stood. He looked directly at Jamal and his mother, his expression sincere. "We should have done better. We should have investigated thoroughly before jumping to conclusions, and for that, I deeply apologize." Jamal felt his mother's grip tighten on his hand. An apology wouldn't erase what happened, but it was a start. Tanya exhaled sharply, blinking back tears. She wrapped her arms around Jamal, holding him close. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could finally breathe. The courtroom stayed silent, watching the moment unfold. But then, Judge Williams' voice cut through the air. As for Officer Richards, Jamal's relief stalled. Tanya looked up, her expression shifting. They had won their case. But what about the man responsible for all of this? Richards, who had stood motionless the entire time, finally lifted his gaze. Sweat dripped from his brow. Judge Williams's next words would decide his fate. Will Richards finally face justice, or will the system protect him? The courtroom fell silent as Judge Williams prepared to announce her ruling on Officer Richards' fate. Jamal and his mother sat tense, their fingers intertwined. They had won their case, but would the officer who started it all face real consequences? Then a voice broke the silence. "Your Honor, I'd like to testify." The entire room turned their heads. Detective Monroe stood up. His eyes were steady, his face unreadable. But one thing was clear. He had something to say. Judge Williams nodded. "Proceed, Detective Monroe." Monroe stepped forward, cleared his throat, and took a deep breath. "I've worked with Officer Richards for years, and I can no longer stay silent." Richards stiffened. His fingers curled into tight fists. Monroe's voice grew stronger. "This isn't the first time Officer Richards has arrested an innocent black person without evidence." Gasps spread through the courtroom. Monroe continued. "There have been multiple complaints against him for racial profiling, complaints that were ignored, cases where he assumed guilt based on nothing but the color of someone's skin." Tanya's eyes widened. Jamal wasn't the first. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. People exchanged glances, whispering amongst themselves. The truth was finally coming out. Judge Williams raised a hand, commanding silence. Then she turned to Richards. "Do you deny these allegations?" Richards' face burned red. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to defend him. No one spoke. Judge Williams let out a long breath. "Given this testimony and the evidence presented, I am ordering Officer Richards' immediate suspension pending a full investigation." Gasps filled the courtroom. Jamal's heart pounded. Was this really happening? Richards' eyes blazed with anger. "This is ridiculous. I did my job." His voice echoed through the room. Judge Williams's expression remained firm. "You abused your power, and now you will face the consequences." Richard's face twisted with rage. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the courtroom. Jamal watched him go, his chest rising and falling with disbelief. Richards is suspended, but will the system actually hold him accountable? Or will he find a way to escape justice? The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and suddenly Jamal was surrounded. A wall of flashing lights and microphones pushed toward him, voices overlapping in a frenzy. "Jamal, how does it feel to be free? Do you have anything to say about Officer Richards? Are you planning to take legal action?" Jamal blinked against the blinding cameras. The weight of everything that had happened still pressed on his chest. He had walked into that courtroom as an accused criminal, and now he was walking out as a symbol of something bigger. His mother, Tanya, stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Her face was tired but proud. She had fought for her son, and she had won. Jamal took a deep breath, glancing at his mother before stepping forward. He looked directly into the cameras, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I just want people to be treated fairly." The crowd went silent for a moment. His words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of the truth. Jamal wasn't seeking revenge. He wasn't looking for fame. He just wanted justice, not just for himself, but for every kid who had ever been judged before they were even heard. His mother squeezed his shoulder, her eyes shining with tears. He was just a boy, But today he had spoken like a man. Miss Carter, the attorney who had fought for Jamal in court, stepped forward. She smiled at him, then turned to Tanya. "Jamal has a bright future. If he's interested, I'd like to help him explore opportunities for college and internships." Jamal's eyes widened. After everything, someone believed in him. Tanya covered her mouth, overcome with emotion. For the first time in days, relief flooded her heart. As the cameras continued to flash, Jamal realized something. This wasn't just an ending, it was a new beginning. What's next for Jamal? Will he take the opportunity and use his voice for change? 1 month later, everything had changed. Officer Richards, once untouchable, was no longer a police officer. After Jamal's case went public, more complaints surfaced. Families who had been too scared to speak out before finally came forward. The department had no choice but to launch a full investigation. The verdict? Richards was fired. Jamal's mother watched the news that morning, tears in her eyes. Justice had finally been served. But for her, the real victory wasn't just in Richards losing his job. It was in knowing that her son's voice had made a difference. And Jamal, his life was changing too. He was no longer just the boy who had been wrongfully accused. He was now a voice for others. When a local youth organization heard his story, they invited him to speak at a community event about justice. At first, he wasn't sure. He wasn't used to people listening to him. But then, he thought about all the kids who didn't get their voices heard, the ones who weren't lucky enough to have a video prove their innocence. And so, he said yes. On the day of the event, Jamal stood on a stage in front of hundreds of young people. He looked out at the crowd, at kids his age, younger, older, all of them watching him, waiting for his words. He took a deep breath. A month ago, I was sitting in a jail cell for something I didn't do. The room stilled. I thought no one would believe me. I thought my life was over. But the truth came out. And I learned something important. Your voice matters. Even when people try to silence you, even when they treat you unfairly, you have to stand up. The audience nodded, hanging on to his every word. Jamal's voice grew stronger, and if you see injustice, don't stay quiet. Speak up, fight back, because one voice can change everything. The crowd erupted into applause. Jamal's mother wiped away a tear, watching her son step into his power. What will Jamal do next with his new platform? Jamal stood on the stage, his heart pounding, but this time, not with fear. He looked out at the sea of faces before him, young people, parents, community leaders, all waiting for his final words. His mother, tears shining in her eyes, sat in the front row beside Miss Carter, the lawyer who had fought for him. They had been his rock through it all. Jamal took a deep breath, gripping the microphone tightly. No one should be judged by the color of their skin. His voice rang through the auditorium. We all deserve fairness. We all deserve justice. A wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Some people stood clapping, others nodded, their faces filled with emotion. Jamal's words weren't just words, they were truth. He had been thrown into a nightmare, treated as guilty without proof. But today, he was standing in his power. He lifted his chin, looking directly at the crowd. If you stay true to yourself, the truth will always come out. The room erupted into cheers. His mother smiled proudly, clapping along with the others. Miss Carter looked at Jamal with admiration. She had defended him, but now he was speaking for himself. Jamal felt something shift inside him. He had spent so much time just wanting to move past what had happened. But now he realized his story could help others. This wasn't just his fight. It was bigger than him, and he wasn't backing down. The fight for justice isn't over, but as long as we stand together, we can change the world.